Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And we are nearly through France in World War II week, but this is going to be a crack of a show. We are talking about the fall of France in 1940, how that created Vichy France, and particularly what that influence that had on the USA and the UK. And my guest wrote an incredibly good book about Paris that I absolutely loved when it first came out. I reread it recently, and he then tackled this subject of Vichy for predominantly an English-speaking audience, which I have to say, hands off to Michael Neiberg for taking that on, because I just said to him before going live, explaining Vichy France and the deal and all the complications behind it to a French audience is difficult enough. Explaining it to an English-speaking audience is another hurdle, because in my experience, Americans and Britons coming to Normandy, they kind of ask about Vichy France. You try and explain it, and they kind of don't want to actually. They don't want to. They realize they've bitten off more than they can chew. It's a very complicated subject. But Michael Neiberg is the chair of war studies at the U.S. Army War College. He has spoken about France in both World War II and in the First World War. So we're delighted to have him as a guest today. So good afternoon, Michael. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So, as I just said there in the introduction there, tackling this whole subject of Vichy France, how the USA responded to it, how that affected its relationship with Great Britain, and all the figures involved. As I said, it's quite a task to take on. Why did you feel now was the time to kind of bring this subject to a largely American audience?
I could give you a really good scholarly answer, but the truth is, I was watching the American game show Jeopardy, and it was their tournament of champions, so it was their best players. And the final question was to name the collaborationist government that ran France during World War II, and none of the three former champions had any idea what the host was talking about. And I had been thinking about Vichy for a long time. I greatly admired the work of scholars like Robert Paxton, Henry Rousseau, who had written on this. As you said, it's an endlessly complicated story that keeps you coming back because it just connects to so many things. And it had been on my mind, but I saw that and I thought, someone needs to explain this to Americans, especially, but to a British audience as well. And there might be a way to use this to tell a really important story about what the United States did, what Britain did during the course of the Second World War. So I don't know that I had an aha moment for writing this book, but I certainly remember that Jeopardy episode and thinking,
Wow.
if these three folks don't have any clue what's being discussed here, we need to have someone talking about this.
And well, the great answer. I wasn't expecting you to mention Jeopardy there, but that's fantastic. And I think that if people do have an awareness of Vichy, it's within the context of it only really affecting continental France. If they don't necessarily, accept the fact there's the French colonies that have an influence, there's Madagascar, there's the French parts of Africa and South America, and that can also affect mainland USA, as you write about in the book, about the threat of potentially Germans taking over French territories that would influence the mainland of the USA. So they're not aware of that, and they're certainly, I don't think, aware of the problems and the rifts this caused between this, as I said on Twitter today, this kind of burgeoning American-British relationship that we know kind of hits its stride by 43 and 44. But in 40, it's where the USA are not in the war yet. It's still a very, very fresh and new relationship. And although we know, of course, Churchill and FDR get on very well personally, the two countries have got, at this point of the war, very different aspirations and feelings about storm clouds and what's happening. So there's a lot of layers to this, but we'll dive in, and we've got a PowerPoint you supplied there, so a lot of stuff to talk about there. So let's start with these quotes that are just amazing there, whether we want to read them out or you read them out. But most people in America think of Pearl Harbor as being that defining moment, the one that shocked the country, that galvanized public opinion, that was the realization that we now are in a global war, and this global war is going to affect the USA. But these are all quotes about the fall of France in 1940. So kind of give a bit of context to who are these people, why are they saying it, and how it all came about with regards hearing this news and what the USA had been anticipating was going to happen and what actually did happen.
Yeah, this is an ulterior motive I certainly had in the book. We teach the Second World War, excuse me, as a moment when the United States is more or less sort of minding its own business, and then we're kind of struck from the outside by Japan. And I've never been comfortable with that way of understanding the Second World War. I've never been comfortable with looking at this as the U.S. not being involved in the world before. The phrase isolationism just does not ring true in any way. So another motive I had for writing this book was to look at the way the United States sees the fall of France as this moment when it understands that neutrality is just not going to help it pursue its interests anymore. You're going to have to take a much more active foreign policy. So the people you see here, Henry Stimson became the Secretary of War shortly after the fall of France. Robert Murphy is the kind of lead American diplomat in North Africa. He'll become very central to the book that I write. Harold Ickes is the Secretary of the Interior and a very close friend to FDR. And William Longer is probably the most interesting. When the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, decided to recognize Vichy France as a state, he knew that he was probably doing something that was going to boomerang back in a bad way if this didn't go right. So he brought William Longer, an historian at Harvard, to start documenting what the United States was doing in case he ended up facing serious inquiry, serious problems. So Longer wrote this book called Our Vichy Gamble, and we have his typescript and we have his notes here at Carlisle where I teach. So these are all people who were deeply involved at the beginning of it. I could have quoted a lot of others. Matthew Ridgway, who was then an officer in the War Plans Division, makes similar statements. Everybody that saw this was worried, and as we'll see on the maps and some of the charts that come next, the reason is that the fall of France destroys all of the assumptions the United States had made about its own security in the 1930s and into 1940. So now you really have to go back to a very frightening drawing board and start all over again.
So what you just said there yourself, what were the USA's hopes in the late 1900s? How did they think France was going to, in a sense, keep them safe from what was happening in Nazi Germany? Why would France be pivotal to the USA's own survival, so to speak?
The idea is that France's army and the Royal Navy together will do what happened in 1914 to 1917. It'll delay Germany, it'll hold Germany long enough for the United States to do what it did in the last war, put together an improvised army, send it over to Europe and become the decisive factor. And very few American strategists talk about it this way, but if you don't have to spend money on worrying about Europe, you can focus on the Pacific, which many American strategists want to do, or you can just spend that money somewhere else. So while everybody else is rearming and everybody else is getting worried and everybody else is rethinking their strategic plans, for the most part, until the fall of France, the United States isn't doing that. Then when France fell in 1940, all of a sudden, all of that thinking goes away. Now France goes from being a sort of a major player in the guaranteeing of U.S. security to a potential threat, as we'll see on the next couple of maps. Political scientists call this free riding, that in effect what you do is you depend on a third state, you depend on another country to defend your security. And it's after the fall of France, I argue, that the United States decides it's never going to do that again, no matter what it has to do. It's not going to free ride ever again. And the map you have here is a wonderful example of that.
I mean, and this is the thing, as I said in the top of the show, that I don't think your average person realizes the extent of the French Empire in 1920s and 30s. I think they understand the British Empire because we know of the battles that ensued for places like Singapore and then the Australians and Port Moresby and all that, and Malaya and all that. But I think the French Empire has sort of fallen off the radar a bit in terms of our understanding of the global nature of World War II. But France had bases of influence, as you can see on that map there, across the entire globe, and that's the worry, isn't it? It's the worry of what's going on in South America, the worry about Africa. Madagascar is a separate subject. We could talk about a whole show about Madagascar in World War II, and indeed we may do that at some point. So it's not just France itself; it's the whole influence. So we all know now, Michael, that the fall of France happened very, very swiftly. The other countries that had fallen before maybe have been expected to have fallen quite quickly, but France, with the size of its army, the size of its resources, did fall surprisingly quickly. And we're not going to go down the political and military decisions made as to why France fell. We can do that, and we have done that in previous shows. it's the implication for the USA, because as you say, there's this realization that this buffer, this time buying situation has now been gone. So what you say that well, let's talk about the division of France. I know we've discussed this on shows before there, but I'd like to have your take on this and how the Americans particularly are receiving this news, and how it's being played out in the American media at this time. What's the reaction amongst the officials and people that have a say in the USA about this establishment of Vichy?
What's really critical here, as you all know from this, but the map is a good reminder, France is divided into an occupied zone and an unoccupied zone, a free zone, which eventually becomes l'État français, or what we know as the Vichy state, because Vichy becomes its capital. What's critical here, and what's not shown on this map, is that Vichy retained control of the French Navy and retained control of the entire French Empire. So that puts Vichy and whatever this new weird state is in a very strange position. Americans don't really know what it is. They don't really know what it intends to do. They don't know how pro-German it's going to be. Those that want to take some measure of confidence take some measure from Henri-Philippe Pétain, who is the leader of the Vichy state. He's the head of the state. He's a well-known guy in the United States. Most Americans think quite highly of him. But as you noted on the other map, and I'd like to come back to that map, the big question is what will happen to the empire. Those bases in the empire that you see here, especially the 5 that I put stars around, had been elements of American national security, whether consciously or unconsciously, or free rider or not. Now those bases all of a sudden look quite threatening. So the one off the coast of Canada is 2 islands, St. Pierre and Mycloon, which are not military bases in any sense of the term, but they're French possessions right off the coast of Canada, and very worrying to the Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Martinique in the Caribbean holds France's lone aircraft carrier and about half of France's gold. Dakar, Senegal, across the Brazilian bump over into Africa, of course, can interfere with shipping lanes. And then you have Indochina, which sits right off the then American colony of the Philippines. So the strategic geography of the world changes in a flash. And it goes from being something that is either an element of security for the United States or something the U.S. can take for granted to something that all of a sudden looks quite frightening indeed.
And the thing is, I'm guessing, is that no one, as you said it yourself, no one quite understands exactly what Vichy France is. I mean, we understand the geographical division there, but is it a puppet state? Is it controlled by the Germans? Do the Germans have interests of taking it? And it changes as the war goes on. How Vichy is defined by itself is changing, and who's in charge. And say, as I said at the beginning, it's difficult to explain this to a French audience, and they live here and understand the language. But in 1940, with the USA, its distance from Europe, this must have been a very confusing situation and quite panic-inducing. I mean, we talk about the panic brought about by Pearl Harbor a year later, but this is more of a political panic. So what were the USA's options at this point with regards to its own security and with regards to its role as, because it isn't a superpower yet. It's not. It will become a superpower as the war goes on, but its role on the world stage, so to speak, because they're not necessarily the same, are they? It's USA security and its role globally are not necessarily in conflict of interest in a sense.
Right. Again, Americans are trying to figure out what this thing is that is Vichy. Most Americans seem to have understood instinctively that whatever it's becoming, it's not good for the United States. Even if it's neutral, it's still a potential threat out there. If it goes pro-German or pro-Italian, it's a very big threat indeed, especially if that fleet, that powerful modern French fleet, goes over to the Axis side. Even if all it does is provide inspiration for people in Latin America to conduct pro-Axis coups, that is not even from the outside. If they do it on their own, it's a net negative for the United States. There's nothing good in what's happening in Vichy. So the options for the United States really are to ignore it, recognize it, or embrace the opposition that Charles de Gaulle is beginning to form. That third option is simply not an option for most Americans for reasons that I can discuss. But as you have here on the slide, this is the big concern. It's what happens to the French fleet. If the French fleet joins the Italian and German fleets, not only is it a threat in the sheer numbers, it's a threat in the bases that this fleet could use, most especially Dakar in Senegal, Martinique in the Caribbean. It changes things in a heartbeat if that happens. The Vichy government has said repeatedly that it won't let that happen, that the fleet will remain neutral. Admiral Darlan even says that he'll sink the fleet before he sees anybody not French command it. But the same things that motivate Winston Churchill to launch the attack at Mers el-Kabir worry the Americans. What happens if somehow the Germans get a handle of it? So even though most Americans are worried about this situation, they are nevertheless, for the most part, in favor of Churchill's decision to hit this fleet at Mers el-Kabir, simply because it takes some of those capital ships out of the equation. And you can see William Bullitt, the former U.S. ambassador to France, bluntly warning FDR, you will be unable to protect the United States if the Axis gets control of this fleet.
And let's remind ourselves, Michael, just how big the French fleet was. It was second only to the British Royal Navy at this time of the war. The USA, well, we'll talk about what the USA has in 1940 a bit later on, but essentially not very much. People talk about the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, as being this massive, great force, and it was certainly big. But the French fleet was bigger in terms of capital ships, and we've talked about a lot on World War II TV about the early part of the war, about potential threats, because sometimes some of the potential threats we now see were never realistic, but at the time they were perceived as being very real. I always use the example of, in Britain, people thinking the Germans would send in paratroopers dressed as nuns into the UK. It sounds absolutely ridiculous now, but at the time it was a genuine concern of not just the public, but senior politicians were openly stating there might be this, we'll come on to fifth column later, this fifth column element. So just because we may now consider, well, the Germans were never going to get their hands on the French fleet, I'm not saying that is or isn't possible. The fact is, in 1940, it was a potential threat. And that potential threat is what we're talking about, as seen through the eyes of 1940.
Yeah, you can do a simple exercise. I know strategists do it today, where you just take an X and Y axis graph and you plot what are the most likely threats and what are the most dangerous threats, and which one do you deal with first. This is a threat that is certainly dangerous and potentially quite likely. So if you're doing that XY axis exercise in 1940, this is going to be one of those things that's going to pop up as one of those things you just have to figure out how you're going to deal with. Because if that fleet, which is modern, it is very professional, very well run, very well led. If that fleet all of a sudden becomes an arm of the Germans and Italians rather than acting as a deterrent to them, you have a problem you really don't have a way of solving, which is what Bullitt is indicating here.
And we touched on it about Churchill's order to sink a lot of the French fleet, and there's the picture of the Jean Bart there that after the damage there. But this is one of those incidents that not only caused huge repercussions within France, it also causes rifts between the USA and the UK in their reaction to this, because there are different ideas, as we said there, about what the response should be. But for those who don't know, the French fleet is a hit. Was it 1,000 French sailors are killed by British bombs? And
that's not what this photograph is. This is from Operation Torch. But you're absolutely right.
It serves the purpose there of showing that there aren't many photos of the. We're talking about another. Right. I'm mixing my my battles here. But in 1940, that this destruction of the fleet there, it was a big event, wasn't it? And how was it perceived in the news in the USA?
Well, the great worry is that incident will lead Vichy France to declare war on Great Britain. And in fact, the Vichy French do a couple of raids against Gibraltar and Malta to make the point. But there's a real fear that France is going to enter the war as a full belligerent against Great Britain. And what would the United States do in that case, while the United States is still neutral? So there is a real worry, and British politicians mention it. I cite a couple of them in the book where they're saying, look, by all rules of the game, we should be at war with France right now. We just attacked their fleet. They just attacked us in Gibraltar. We should be at war with them. So for the United States to then turn around and recognize the Vichy government, for the United States government to actually talk about sending food, fuel, other things to Vichy, is to British leaders quite a puzzle. I mean, by all rights, Vichy should be a belligerent, full belligerent on the side of the Axis powers. So it's again, it's difficult to read. It looks different from the United States than it does from London, from Whitehall. But it is immediately an issue of real concern between the U.S. and Great Britain because the approach of the two countries is so different.
So, what was the American rationale for sending food and supplies to Vichy? I mean, we know there is an issue of food shortages, but and so there's a humanitarian aspect behind it. But why do the US think it's a good political move at this moment in time?
Well, I want to emphasize that this is not a good news story for the United States government in 1940. The United States, in my view, made some very bad decisions based on very faulty logic and reasoning. And no part of my book is an attempt to either defend what the United States government did here or to rehabilitate any part of Vichy at all. There were arguments made at the time, and there were arguments made that have been made later. The ones they make at the time are that Vichy is so important from a geographic and military perspective that to ignore it or not recognize it means that the United States will have no influence over it at all. In other words, better to use what few levers we have over them to try to influence their behavior than to ignore them and drive them even further into Germany's arms. The other argument is a quite legal one, that there's no justification for recognizing Charles de Gaulle, who's simply a renegade brigadier general in the Americans' eyes, who happens to have gone to London and said, "Hey, I'm the French government now." Whereas the government at Vichy was legally voted in. It's the legally constituted government of France. So from a strictly legal perspective, there's no reason in the United States government's view, the United States Department of State's view, why Vichy should not be recognized as a legitimate government, at least the unoccupied part of it. I think, as I write in the book, I think a lot of this is actually coming out of fear. It's actually coming out of this awareness that the world has changed overnight. The things you believed a couple of weeks ago, you can no longer believe. And they're reaching for any policy that will bring back some sort of stability into that system. So some of these rationales have a kind of surface veneer of truth. Others, I think, are stories the United States is just trying to tell itself. And as I also write in the book, and we hopefully can talk about a little bit here, there are things about Vichy that the United States likes. It is anti-communist, it is anti-socialist, it is politically conservative in that way. And as I hope we'll talk about here, at least some of the leaders of Vichy are actively reaching out to the United States and saying, look, nothing that has happened here should diminish in any way the friendship between our two countries. And the Americans are way too eager to buy into that.
That's true. And you said a good word there. You said fear, because again, like with my paratroop analogy, German pilots dressed as nuns. Fear is huge in 1940 and even into 41 the USA. And you write a lot about some of the films that came out that didn't find an audience when they came out, but a few months later situations have changed. They suddenly find an audience, and this idea of the fifth column. So I think fifth column is was definitely the buzzword internationally of 1940, or buzzwords. I don't think we appreciate today what that really meant at the time. It seems to have dropped out of our lexicon these days, but back then fifth column was huge. So explain what some of the fears were in the USA, whether they're founded or unfounded, about what could happen. There's German population in the USA, there's French population in the USA. So you write a lot about this particular film here and this idea. So explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, I really like this one because this film came out in 1939 to no reception at all, despite the fact that it had Edward G. Robinson, who was a big star. After the fall of France, Warner Brothers re-released it. It becomes a runaway hit. So the sentiment in the United States is that a country like France doesn't fall unless it's being torn apart from the inside. That people inside France did this, and William Bullitt and others report back to Roosevelt that they know, they've heard stories, they've heard people talking about fifth column agents who are acting against France when Germany invades, all of this stuff. So the fear in the United States is partly of what German agents might do in the United States, what we would today call sleeper cells that are acting in the United States. It's also the fear of what they might do in Latin America. And if they start to turn Latin American governments pro-German or pro-Axis, then you really are facing a tremendous problem. You're having to deal with that Southern front that you hoped you wouldn't have to deal with. So it's in this time period that Roosevelt orders the Justice Department to ignore a recent Supreme Court decision on wiretapping. Roosevelt's argument is that wiretap decision was made on a revenue fraud case. This is different. This is national security. This is when all kinds of anti-alien, anti-foreign, anti-immigrant activities start happening. Ickes writes in his diary, our super patriots are going crazy. Eleanor Roosevelt starts to write a few columns, kind of telling everybody to calm down. There's a case, I think it's in Georgia, where the governor wants to kick all non-U.S. citizens out of defense plants and anything that has to do with the national defense. And this is all coming because of this fear that the real reason France fell was because of this sabotage activity inside the country. And that's very worrying to the United States.
Which brings us to these decisions being made. And again, when I said earlier about a lot of people believing that Pearl Harbor is the big single event that kicks everything off. Well, politically, this, as your slide explains here, the May and June 1940 period is where you are making absolutely huge changes to the way the US governs, to the politics of spending. I mean, you went from spending almost nothing on defense to you just kind of billions overnight. And why is it, do you think, you teach this history, that this has all sort of fallen away from our understanding? Why don't Americans talk about this period as being so monumental in America's transition from being an observer of the events of World War II to being a participant in those events? Because, as I said, it's Pearl Harbor, of course, is another major chapter, but these things here are huge, and how they swept through these, Congress and the Senate, things that would have never have got off the ground even just weeks earlier. Once France fell, the floodgates were open. So I know you talk about this in great length in the book, and folks, I recommend an extraordinary amount of books on this channel, but this is an absolutely amazing book. I only received it Monday. I haven't actually finished it. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. Hopefully over tonight and tomorrow we'll finish it, but it's just absolutely amazing. So run us through, Michael, some of these incredible changes that happened in this period.
Yeah, as you noted, a lot of these are things that had kind of been discussed and couldn't get out of committee or couldn't get enough support to even really become legislation. After the fall of France, they start coming left and right. The Two Ocean Navy Act, the Burke-Wadsworth Selective Service Act is the first peacetime conscription for the United States. The 2 million man army, the initial proposal is 4 million men, and most observers thought that if Roosevelt and Marshall had asked Congress for it, they would have gotten it. As you can see, this is the one that boggles my mind. You have to be inflation adjusted in your head, but $12 billion committed to national defense at a time when the federal budget was less than $9 billion, and at a time when budgets were balanced. So this is remarkable, and it is also the moment when the United States went to the equivalent of a unity government or a coalition government, which of course we don't normally have in the United States, by pulling in two Republicans, Frank Knox and Henry Stimson, to become Secretary of Navy and Secretary of War. So this is a massive change, and Frank Knox in particular is important because he's from the Midwest, which had been a center of isolationism. He's a newspaper man, so he understands how to play this publicity game. Stimson is as old school member of the establishment as it is possible to imagine, former cabinet member, both Secretary of State and War. So this is a major change that Roosevelt is introducing here. Even Roosevelt's decision to run for office again in 1940 is he kept his cards pretty close to the vest. We don't have a single document that lays out his thinking, but it's pretty clear it was the fall of France that led him to believe that he had to go for a third term in office, which was unprecedented. It had never been done in the United States, and now never will be done again because they changed the Constitution after Roosevelt had died. So these are major, major changes in the way that Americans are thinking about it, and they're very, very popular changes. The real hardcore isolationists, men like Charles Lindbergh, even they start to argue for increased spending on national defense. I found some Vichy reports where the Vichy embassy is writing back to Paris and saying, look, you can't count on guys like Lindbergh anymore. They may not want America to get in the war, but even they understand, even they are on the bandwagon now. So it's a major transformation. And I argue in the book, and I talk to students here at the Army War College, the United States never, ever turns back from this, except for a very brief period at the end of World War II. After that, the United States has always been committed to a large spending on defense and not relying on a third-party state to free ride off of ever again. That's how deep the fear was in 1940. It continued all the way into the post-war world, and I would say we're still living in the shadow of that.
I mean, amazing stuff, and you speak as well as you write, of course. But let's talk a little bit about the various players that were emerging from within Vichy itself and other parts of the French Empire, you want to call it, whatever you want to call it there. And everybody, of course, will know about Charles de Gaulle, and they particularly know about, post-war president, of course, and but in 1940, as you said earlier, he was essentially a nobody. He had happened to have got out of France to the UK, and he did this amazing proclamation to the French public, although very few people actually heard it at the time. Right. And if they did hear it or see it written down, they didn't know who this de Gaulle figure was. But very quickly, although Churchill on a kind of personal level finds him a bit difficult, Churchill kind of selects him as possibly his horse in the forthcoming race. But the USA don't have necessarily have the same feeling about de Gaulle, because there are some people this is where it gets complicated with these inner relationships, because it explains to who some of the people in Vichy are, and how they already have an established connection with the USA, because that's to me is very, very important to this discussion.
Yeah, can I just talk about de Gaulle for just a second?
Sure, please.
So just before COVID, the first place where I heard the words COVID-19, I was in Ethiopia, and looking at the Ethiopia campaign rather intensely for some work that I was doing here in Carlisle. And one of the things that kind of hit me in the face that I knew about but didn't think about, Churchill and de Gaulle have a very important common interest, which is Ethiopia. There is an Italian force and a Vichy force on the other side in what we today call, I guess that would be Djibouti, which is Vichy run. But on the other side, the western side, what is today the Central African Republic, that governor declared for Charles de Gaulle. So Churchill and de Gaulle, Philippe Leclerc is involved in this. Anthony Eden gets involved in this. The future Prime Minister René Pleven gets involved in this, where they cobble together a Free French, British Commonwealth force that invades Ethiopia to eliminate that threat to the Nile River Valley, to the Red Sea, to the Sudan, and ultimately to the southern frontier of Egypt. So right from the beginning, de Gaulle and Churchill have something in common, a strategic aim in common that is completely irrelevant to the United States, except that for the fact that Roosevelt wants the Red Sea secure before Lend-Lease ships can go up there. Other than that, the Americans don't care about East Africa at all. But Churchill and de Gaulle absolutely do. So there's a way in which these two guys are linked that the United States has nothing to do with. And I think that's part of the reason why de Gaulle and Churchill, even though personally that relationship is quite fraught, they have an interest in common.
Which brings us back to this idea about France's colonies around the world, that in the general narrative of understanding World War II don't get a look in. I mean, we talk about North Africa because of the fighting that happened there. We maybe mention Madagascar, but we don't talk about the political influence of these other former British or former British colonies, and the French colonies there, and then the Dutch. And there's a complicated situation there, and a lot of power based there that could be harnessed in the wrong way and affect global aspirations and the course of the war. So, but
it's the one thing that Vichy and de Gaulle agree on, that whatever happens to the French Empire at the end of the war, it's going to remain French. So it's the one that they're all imperialists to their core, because they believe that as long as France has that navy and as long as France has that empire, it's a world power. So to get to the leaders of Vichy, which was where you were going when I detoured us a little bit to Ethiopia, that's what this guy on the left, Pierre Laval, believes that he'll be able somehow to do when this is over. Laval is the prime minister of Vichy for 2 periods. There's an interregnum in between, and Laval is firmly convinced that as long as France has that navy and as long as France has that empire, what's going to happen eventually is that Germany, the land power, and Britain, the sea power, will end up unable to knock each other out of this war. France's diplomatic role will be to be the third lever in all of this. Lever's not the right thing, but the third actor in all of this. That Germany will be able to fight a war without France, but it won't be able to conduct a peace without France. The Americans look at this as completely delusional. Laval had won Time magazine's Man of the Year in the mid-1930s, but nevertheless, he's not a particularly popular man in the United States and becomes increasingly unpopular. As you can see, I love this quotation from an American diplomat that Laval is a squatty, villainous-faced old man. He's the clear villain in most of this. But that's balanced by, of course, the man on the right, Henri-Philippe Pétain, who is a great hero to the French out of World War I and a great hero in the United States out
Yeah.
of World War I. And a friend of mine in New Orleans, where I spent some time, where my daughter's a college student, reminded me that the great Antoine's restaurant in New Orleans had a dish named after Pétain and one named after Foch in the interwar years. So
Wow.
these were guys that were that famous. And Pétain is the rock on which the United States wants to build this relationship with Vichy. That as long as Pétain is the guy, as long as they can convince themselves that Pétain is really the one pulling the levers of power, then they believe there's some hope for Vichy. If they believe that power is tilting over to Laval, then they get very, very concerned about the future of a Vichy-U.S. relationship under Laval. But as long as Pétain seems to be the guy, there are Americans who are willing to put some confidence in him. The problem is that he's, I think he's 84 in 1940. He's getting old. He's clearly entering his decline. And anybody that gets close to him realizes the cult of personality around him does not really reflect the capabilities of the man.
Yeah, and we should just kind of remind ourselves that the words themselves of Pétain and Vichy mean something very different now because of the baggage we know should be rightly associated with those names. But because people have said we should be explaining, well, my other half said we should explain where Vichy comes from, because Vichy's a spa town that just happened to be a kind of a place that ended up where the government was set up. But the name Vichy didn't mean anything to anybody prior to this. And so if you're an American reading what was Vichy France any more than you're a British person, Vichy didn't have the connotation it does now. When we hear Vichy France, we think of collaboration and we think of all the events that conspired there, but we didn't have that at the time. And Pétain, as you say, it's important to understand just how popular still Pétain was, even within France. Even in 1940, maybe even into 1941, he's still a legend.
Even into 1944,
yeah,
even to 44, 45. I found plenty of documents between the British and the Americans where the British believe the United States is looking to recreate post-war France on Pétain instead of de Gaulle. He has that much charisma, that much pull, and even the Americans who are close to Pétain realize, with Pétain, Vichy's pretty bad. Without Pétain, it will completely fall apart. It is the image of Pétain that holds it together. And the office that he used in Vichy is still owned by a group called the Association of the Friends of the Marshal, and they control it. They still run it. So you may know in the 1970s, some very conservative right-wing Frenchman dug up his grave on the Ile d'Yeu and tried to bury it at Vermont, at Douaumont, underneath the flagpole at the Battle of Verdun. So, Pétain's name still, decades after, still has this kind of allure because of the fame that he had at the end of World War I, and he's anti-Republican politics.
And that raises another subject we could talk about, because you talk about the fact that Macron wanted to kind of acknowledge Pétain's role in the First World War on the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, and it kind of essentially backfired on him because you're not allowed to mention Pétain's positive deeds any kind of way in certain parts of France, because everything he did in World War II has now completely overshadowed any heroism. And it's not like it's a bit of heroism in the First World War. He saved France, not
Twice.
Single-handedly, but
Twice.
He did.
Yeah.
But let's talk about this figure here, because here's someone that I think a lot of people watching this will not have heard of, this incredibly interesting, charismatic, and complicated figure who has kind of more fingers in more pies than Sweeney Todd, we say in England.
Yeah.
So
his name is René de Chambrun. He is a statutory U.S. citizen because he was directly descended from the Marquis de Lafayette. He is related by marriage to a woman named, he's married through the Longworth family, into which Theodore Roosevelt's daughter Alice had married into. That means he is a cousin by marriage to both Theodore Roosevelt and that side of the family, which is very conservative, and Franklin Roosevelt, the other end of the Roosevelts, which is a little bit liberal. So he has the statutory U.S. citizenship. He has family connections to both the United States, both to the Roosevelts and to the Marquis de Lafayette. He's also married to, and you see her on his arm here in the picture on the left, the daughter of Pierre Laval, José Laval. So he's connected to both the Lavals and the Roosevelts. And when France fell, Laval sent him to the United States to present a pro-French view, a pro-Vichy view of what had just happened. And he's so well connected that he spends part of a weekend on the presidential yacht with Franklin Roosevelt and then goes to stay with Alice Roosevelt. And Alice, for those of you who don't know who she is, she was so outspoken that Theodore Roosevelt is supposed to have said, I can either govern the country or I can govern Alice. There's no way that I can do both. So through those connections, he ends up staying in the United States. He gets a room at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. He does a kind of cross-country tour. He quickly writes a book. A lot of his papers are at Stanford right now because he spent some time out there. And the message he is delivering to anybody that will listen is this new Vichy government is the best you can hope for out of this disaster. Vichy will be anti-fascist, but more importantly, it will be anti-Bolshevik. And more important than that, it will remain pro-American. And that is an image of France that is irresistible for people like Franklin Roosevelt. Again, it's a piece of driftwood to cling to in this crazy stormy sea that is 1940.
It's making the best out of a bad situation. It's again reminding us in this world we live in today of constant access to media. If it was happening now, we'd have people within France tweeting and telling us what's going on and what the reality is of this means, and talking about the rules that start being enforced. But at the time, the people of the USA can only get their information from a few sources, and if
Right.
and someone like Chambrun and others are able to influence, perhaps more so because of the limited amount of information that will be arriving in the USA. I mean, there's not much press coming out of Vichy. What is it going to be controlled and manipulated? So these people have an incredible influence on what's going on, both politically with FDR, but also to the general public, because he knows the right people, essentially, doesn't he?
Right. Right. Not only does he know the right people, he's able to operate across the political spectrum because the Roosevelts themselves are so divided. So he's able to deal with the folks on the left. He's able to deal with folks on the right, and he's able to project this image that is exactly what people want to hear. What he's trying to sell is exactly what the United States wants to buy. He's not the only one. There are others. The famous writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, he's very anti-Charles de Gaulle too. So a kind of tacit agreement comes up. If the United States won't support de Gaulle, then Vichy won't actively support the Germans, at least in anything that would hurt the United States. And again, that becomes an image that's just too good to resist. And as you see here, Franklin Roosevelt sending Ambassador William Leahy, the former admiral, then future admiral of the United States, over to try to deal with Patan and deal with Vichy. The original person he wanted was John Pershing, because Pershing and Patan had developed a very close friendship. Pershing's health simply won't permit that to happen. Leahy believed when he got over there that a relationship with Vichy was going to be very difficult, that Patan was being manipulated by these folks like Pierre Laval beneath him. And several times Leahy writes back to Washington and says, I haven't been able to do anything positive here. We should end this mission. We've chosen the wrong side. We should get out of this and just start again. And Roosevelt and Cordell Hull are unwilling to do that because, again, they're afraid of what Vichy might do in the absence of an American pressure on them, even though that pressure is not producing the results that the United States wants.
So to recap where we are, and people are commenting how much they're enjoying this and learning. I mean, so that the USA are being more and more convinced that the Vichy at the moment is the best horse to back because the other options just aren't possible. The UK, though, Churchill and his cabinet have other thoughts. So, as I said at the beginning, we know about this American-British relationship of the latter part of the war, but how was this relationship, burgeoning relationship between America and Britain, being affected by the USA's official recognition of Vichy France?
Yeah, it's the point that causes the most friction in the U.S.-UK relationship. That those St. Pierre and Mycloon, those two little islands that I talked about a little bit earlier off the coast of Newfoundland, a Free French unit goes in there. The de Gaulle sends there. They take over the island. They depose the pro-Vichy governor. They dismantle the radio transmitter that had been broadcasting Axis propaganda. Cordell Hull, the American Secretary of State, almost resigned over this because he saw it as a British-French plot to undermine the Monroe Doctrine and It's just the issue that they constantly disagree about. I also think there's an imperial angle to this too. The Americans certainly are afraid that the British like de Gaulle because there's a kind of an agreement between them that de Gaulle will help support the British Empire at the end of the war, and the British will maintain the French Empire at the end of the war, even though there will be points of friction they're going to have to negotiate. And Roosevelt very quickly has come to the conclusion that he doesn't want the empires to exist in their current form or at all at the end of the war. So right away, there are personality issues playing. There are national interests playing. There's also a fear in the United States that de Gaulle is going to turn into either another dictator along the mode of Franco or Salazar in Spain and Portugal, or he could become, as sometimes he's referred to, a Kerensky, referring to the Russian leader that takes over after the deposition of the Tsar, and then he's taken out by the Bolsheviks. So the fear is that de Gaulle will undermine and destroy France, but he won't be strong enough to resist a communist uprising that will come soon after. So the fear in the United States is that de Gaulle not only is not a representative leader in France because he hasn't been elected by anybody or appointed by any real authority, but that he's either a dictator in waiting or he's going to be a puppet for Stalin.
And this is where probably the long-term vision of politicians is going to be very different for the short-term view of most of the citizens of the countries we're talking about, where they're hoping for a victory next week, as opposed to thinking about the long-term legacy of the British Empire around the world. That's not what people who are wishing their sons good luck as they get on a boat for wherever they're going around the world. That's not what they're thinking about. They're thinking about the immediate problem of Nazi Germany, expanding its empire. There's the Japanese haven't started theirs yet, but there's fears that that's going to be happening. We know from code breaking that the Japanese are kind of getting aspirational about taking over the world. So that's what people are thinking about, the immediacy, but politicians thinking about the long term, and communism long term. That's not on most people's radar. But I think these cartoons that you wanted to show us, I think, are interesting because, again, they kind of convey some of the thinking of this period and how complicated it all is. But you explain why you wanted to share them with us today.
Well, this shows another problem in America's Vichy policy. It is unbelievably unpopular with the United States. The American people are pro-de Gaulle. They're pro-free French. They don't want the United States dealing with Vichy at all. Yet the government is maintaining this policy of recognition and even aid. So these are from Dr. Seuss when he was a political cartoonist, Theodore Geisel for the New York magazine PM. The one on the left has Hitler leading Mussolini and Laval along with a stinking, I guess, fish bones there, saying, "Carry on, my faithful dogs, and you shall share equally." The one on the right is the one I really like. This is when Laval came back to the French government, and Hitler, the cat here, is bringing Laval, the rat, back to Pétain's doorstep. And Pétain is saying, "Marianne, look what the cat brought back." So this image of Laval, most often as a rat or some kind of animal, or at any rate a puppet of the Germans, of not really making decisions in the interest of France. This is the way that the American people see Vichy and see Laval, and increasingly see Pétain as well. I think it might be Edward R. Murrow. No, I don't think it's Murrow in this case, but some American political commentator who says, why do we recognize fascism when it's called Hitler, but we don't recognize fascism when it's called Vichy? In other words, we American people can see this. Why are you doing this, U.S. government doing this in our name? And Wendell Willkie, who ran against Roosevelt in 1940, although he's fully supported Roosevelt's foreign policy, comes back from a world tour in 1942 and says, look, Vichy is proof positive that Roosevelt is losing his grip on this war. And then I think the next one I've got is that wonderful clip from Casablanca, which is made while all this is happening. The famous scene at the end where Captain Reynaud, played by Claude Rains, takes a sip of water from a bottle of Vichy water and then throws it into the garbage can. I don't know how many Americans that are watching this brilliant movie today, recognize or appreciate the full symbolism of that. But that scene was shot in 1941. So it's a clear indication that the American people understood what this was and understood the desire to dissociate from Vichy.
And by the way, just a masterstroke to name your chapters after quotations from Casablanca. Whether that was your idea, the publisher's idea, someone in your family, but just a
So
inspired choice there. And
it
it took
was
me a
mine.
couple of chapters to notice it. And then I realized, like, why hadn't I noticed that at the beginning? It was sort of a slow burn on me, and because you'd mentioned Casablanca the film, but I still hadn't. I was just interested in the politics and the intrigue and the story, and then it's Casablanca quotes, and I was really felt stupid that I hadn't noticed it immediately.
It was my idea. The first editor that I talked to about this book hated the idea. The editor that I eventually worked with, my wonderful, wonderful, brilliant editor, Kathleen McDermott at Harvard. Kathleen loved the idea, but it was her idea to put those subtitles for the chapter in as well. But yeah, I'm glad people are picking up on that, because I had a lot of fun with it, and it was kind of my dig in my heels position that the titles were going to stay.
Well, I think it was a good idea. And talking about de Gaulle, and we'll flash up a slide in a minute. But at least I suppose what de Gaulle is saying in 1940 for most people sounds very simple. He's just basically saying we shall still keep on fighting. He's almost echoing the kind of things Churchill is saying. Now, Churchill doesn't know necessarily in 1940 how he is going to be able to continue the fight. There's a lot of kind of just hope within what he's saying, but people want to hear that. They want to hear it's not over till the fat lady sings. And that's essentially what Churchill and people like de Gaulle are saying in 1940. It may be optimistic, it may be based on naivety, but that's what the great British public and a lot of Americans just want to hear, that we're still in the fight, it's not over. So I can understand that completely. But there is another player, a potential player there. So Henri Giraud is someone, again, who is not as talked about as much these days, but there are more than one horse who could become the front runner in this establishment of whatever France is going to become in the future. So let's talk about him a little bit.
Yeah, he's someone that the United States turned to for a little while as maybe an option between Vichy and de Gaulle. He was commanding a French army in 1940. His unit is surrounded. He sends out this famous message: "I'm surrounded by 100 German tanks. I am destroying them one by one." He's captured, escapes from the prison they have him in Saxony. And he looks to be the answer. He has this kind of, telegenic good looks. He's a fighting French soldier with no connection to Vichy whatsoever, because, of course, he was in prison when Vichy was created. He's clearly anti-German. He looks like the kind of person the United States can build into exactly what they want. William Longer, that Harvard historian, calls him the rising star, the great man of the future, all of this. The problem is everybody that gets close to him, French and American, realize he has no political sensibilities at all. He doesn't share the same strategic vision of the war as the Americans and British do. He wants to go right into southern France. He wants to skip North Africa, just go straight into France, which the Americans and British won't do. He speaks very, very rapid French. He doesn't let translators catch up to him. He uses third person when he talks, all of this stuff that drives the Americans crazy. Nevertheless, they try best as they can to boost him until it's pretty obvious that this just isn't going to work. Giraud and de Gaulle, by the way, can't stand each other. This is that very awkward handshake that they exchange at the Casablanca conference, and they're constantly scheming for ways to get rid of the other one. The Americans believe that de Gaulle is training assassins to kill Giraud. It gets really very heated, and I'm lucky. My good friend Andrew Stewart sent me some documents that he found at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which had some of Harold Macmillan, who was then the British resident minister in Algiers, and what he was saying about the rivalry between these two, and the gossip it was going around in Algiers is really wonderful. And I'm grateful to Andrew both for getting me those documents and for constantly telling me you need to write this book. So I have Andrew to thank for both of those things. So Andrew, if you're watching, another thank you to you.
And then there's I think his kind of handsome good looks do come across in that. He looks good for posters, perhaps
he
more so than de Gaulle did at the time, who famously the British say the general with the big outer. He did have a big nose. So I can kind of see there's in looks alone, maybe there's something going for him there. But yeah, we're going to move on to Operation Torch, because this is when everything changes. This sort of house of cards that they kind of had established. Vichy does exist. The UK have just chosen not to recognize it. The USA has, and everyone, there's disagreement about how that they've reached these conclusions. But then it all changes again, because like the fall of France in 1940, another massive great war event then affects the politics. So we talked about Operation Torch as a military landing last week in North Africa, or sorry, the week before in North Africa week. But how does this change the state of play in terms of the politics and again the relationship between the USA and the UK?
Yeah, so we all know this is a complicated operation that there's not pure unanimity on, even inside the US and UK staffs. The question is, do you tell de Gaulle and Giraud about it, and what role do you give them? Giraud insists that any part of French soil, he has to be the commander-in-chief, and that this operation should come second after Corsica and southern France have been liberated. So in the end, what the United States and Britain decided to do is not tell either one of them about it. So de Gaulle found out when I think it's a British member of parliament that wakes him up and tells him. His response is something like, I hope the Vichyites throw them back into the sea. And this is the response of General Sir Alan Brooke. I understand your bitterness, now overcome it. Giraud is much the same way. If I'm not the commander of this, I don't want to be any part of it. I'm not going to help you. I don't want to be involved. Eventually, both men do support the Allies in what they're doing. I think because they can see that this is going to work. It's not going to be Dieppe. This is going to succeed. And the Allies can either operate in North Africa with you, or they can operate without you. But it's quite clear Dwight Eisenhower is going to be in charge. There will not be a French overall commander, even on French soil. So the politics of this, the nastiness, the bitter feelings left over from this linger for a very, very long time on both sides. The United States never did forgive either Giraud or de Gaulle for not immediately coming to support of the operation. So there's a lot of bitter, hurt feelings that come about. And then, of course, what happens next makes that even more complicated.
And just, I said we weren't talking about the military side of it, but as we talked about in the North Africa week, there was one point they were considering even having the British troops wearing American flags on their sleeves because of the feeling that the Vichy would have towards Britain. Because we haven't talked much yet so far about. We've talked about the USA's vision of Vichy and what the UK think. We've not really talked so much about what France is thinking about either country as well. But there's a period after the destruction of the French fleet by Churchill that all French people despised the British for some time. I mean, this was it was probably a necessary act, but it caused huge anger in France, and which maybe changed a bit when Operation Torch happened. But that's something again we don't talk about enough now. Just how unpopular the British were in both parts of France throughout 41 and I guess 42 and into 43, I suppose, really.
Yeah, you're just 2 years after Mers El Kabir. If another British fleet flying British flags appears off the coast of North Africa, what would you expect Vichy to do? How would you expect them to respond? So it's the politics here are really complicated. I talk about a couple of spy networks that get set up for the United States and Britain to try to figure out what's going on here. Ian Fleming is indirectly involved. There's a secret mission that gets sent to the west of Algiers to try to make contact with a guy named Charles Mast, who's a French general on the ground there. All kinds of projects. That the problem is, as Eisenhower points out, there's just nothing that corresponds to the intel picture that we've got that's really helpful. There's nothing reliable, there's nothing dependable, there's nothing actionable in all that intelligence that's coming out. The tactical stuff is great, where the French forces are, where their artillery pieces are, all that. You can count and measure artillery pieces and airplanes. It's an awful lot harder to try to assess what the political leanings of these folks are going to be, especially when most of the senior officers have families back in metropolitan France that the Germans can very easily get their hands on.
And it's not like it was even consistent. The response in Torch wasn't even consistent from the landing site to landing sites. We know Iran put out much more of a fight there than some other places did. So it wasn't even that there was a single reaction. The reactions were different depending on the loyalty of individual commanders. It almost goes down to platoon level. Some of these Vichy troops as to what they believed in, who they thought was the big hope, and what their feeling was about empire and country and national. It was a very, very complicated situation. Again, writing about Operation Torch as a military operation is complicated. Writing about it as a political one is even more so. But we'll move on to everybody's favorite French person at this part of the war, Darlan. So again, another incredibly important and talked about a little bit still today, but let's talk about him and bring him into the story, because another incredibly important figure in this whole story.
Yep, a short, bald-headed, pink-faced, needle-nosed, sharp-chinned little weasel, which is about what the Americans and British both think about Darlan. Darlan is the head of the French Navy. He is a very powerful figure, probably behind Patan. He and Laval are at about the same level of power in running Vichy. He is anti-British to the core, to his bones. He's anti-American. Just by coincidence, he's in Algiers when Torch happens. His son Alain had the same variant of polio that FDR had. He was there visiting his son. He was supposed to have left before Torch began. He stayed on to be with his son a little longer. Very long story short, if de Gaulle's not going to help and Giraud is not going to help, Mark Clark and the American leadership turned to Darlan. The deal they cut, the very unpopular, very nasty deal they cut. If Darlan will order Vichy French troops to stop firing on the United States and British forces, the US and Britain will leave Darlan in power in North Africa and let him run North Africa without interference from the Allies. That means that pro-fascist political clubs continue to meet. That means the anti-Semitic laws that were in place continue to be in operation. This is what led Edward R. Murrow. Are we fighting the Nazis or are we sleeping with them? Ernie Pyle, who was there, our enemies laughed at us. It's an extremely unpopular decision. FDR, in about one paragraph, uses the word temporary 5 times when he describes the deal they've made with Darlan. It's very, very controversial. I argue in the book there's no reason to believe that the United States was ready to give up on Darlan. He was doing what they wanted him to do. This is my favorite picture, I think, from all the ones that I found. That's Mark Clark and Darlan shaking hands. What I love about it is on the far right of the picture is Henri-Philippe Pétain looking down, seemingly blessing that photograph, seemingly blessing the agreement here. By the time that Darlan dies, he's assassinated on Christmas Eve, 1942. The Americans are saying nothing but good things. He's doing what we want him to do. Harold Macmillan, I think it was, with a great line, once bought, he stayed bought. Darlan is doing what the United States wants him to do, but boy, cutting a deal with Darlan doesn't really look like much of a victory, does it? And Mark Clark, for those who are not American, this is a terrible baseball mixed metaphor. Once we got him in the box for our side, he pitched big league ball. In other words, he was doing what we wanted him to do. So there's every reason to believe, had he not been assassinated, he might have gone on to rule France for who knows how long. It's entirely possible de Gaulle would have found a way to get him out of the way, just as he did Giraud. And the British are furious with this decision, too. Churchill personally went to the House of Commons and said, we had nothing to do with this deal. It's a terrible, terrible PR decision or PR problem for the United States to deal with working with someone as hated and reviled as Darlan was.
And this is what's so fascinating, in that I think people have come to understand that Clark probably shouldn't have gone for Rome and should have tried to, defeat the German army in Italy instead, this later in the war. But I'm sure that most Americans watching this don't really have much knowledge of this deal he was proposing with Darlan, and that seems to have been dropped. And I wanted to touch on, we talked about before going live, you make a statement somewhere at the beginning of the book about the fact that some of the things you're writing about will not be popular with every American reading it. And in general terms, is it about time the USA addressed some of the, shall we say, poorer decisions that were made in this mid part of the war and kind of confronted them head on?
I absolutely, I think so. I mean, I'm a big believer that unless you confront your history honestly and openly, your chances of benefiting from it diminish. I like the metaphor of going to your doctor, and when your doctor says, let me know your family history, if you're ignorant or dishonest of that family history, it limits what the doctor can do to care for you. So I'm a First World War historian really by training, and it's only in the last 15, 20, 25 years, I think, that we've gotten really honest histories of the First World War. These things take time. Societies we have to know sort of the end of the story a little bit. New archives open up. We're now starting to see it with World War II. Jonathan Fennell has written a brilliant book on Britain in World War II.
Oh, it's brilliant.
That is dismantling a lot of these myths. And so I do think
Daniel
it's
Todman
time.
too, done a similar work. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of folks who are doing this. I think you have to confront honestly this image the United States has of World War II, of the United States kind of sleeping in our beds until Pearl Harbor and then doing everything right except the one big asterisk asterisk we always put in our own history books, which is the internment of Japanese Americans here in the United States. But other than that, we did everything right. Just isn't helpful. Yes, we were on the side of the angels. Yes, we destroyed two, arguably three, maybe more terrible totalitarian regimes. Yes, we were on the side of the angels, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be learning from these other things as well. It doesn't mean we should turn our eyes from some of the other problems, in no small part because some of the problems we dealt with in 1940, 41, 42 are, of course, problems that great powers have to deal with all the time.
Yeah, and Stephen Bork talked about it on Wednesday. The narrative with D-Day of the Saving Ryan heroism, the waving flags, the triumphant arrival, the saving of Europe from itself, and it's not that isn't there. There isn't some truth in that narrative, because of course the part of that is true, but it's quashing the darker side of things. And we talked about France now not embracing its Vichy past, but I said before going online, we talked about recently, folks, you got to go and switch on the French TV. There's another documentary about Patan or Laval or Vichy, and they're acknowledging their role in the rounding up of their own Jewish population. That's happening now. But America, the USA, perhaps hasn't really acknowledged this mid period of the war where some of the decisions we're making were with hindsight not the ones to be made. But we do post torch. Eventually, things do come round to de Gaulle, and de Gaulle is the figure we now know. So this photo here of de Gaulle and Eisenhower later on. So when does everything switch to back everybody agreeing to back de Gaulle?
So I think it happens really late for the United States. De Gaulle the United States sort of recognizes de Gaulle as the leader of a provisional free French government. De Gaulle drops the word provisional very often when he's talking to Americans, but that is part of D-Day, of course. De Gaulle's triumphant entry into Bayeux, into your hometown, shortly after the invasion, infuriates the United States. They think he's trying to steal a march on them. The same thing in de Gaulle's triumphant march through Paris in August. And again, I found those documents, which shows that there were American leaders thinking of jettisoning de Gaulle for Patan as a kind of figurehead well into the end of the war. And even after the war, the American ambassador is reporting back to Harry Truman and the new Secretary of State back in the United States, James Burns, saying, look, our behavior during the war is really making it very difficult for us right now. Either we're accused of supporting Vichy or we're accused of supporting, Darlan and all these nasty guys, when the French people clearly are backing de Gaulle right now. And we continue to have this difficult relationship with de Gaulle, and we've got to get past that. So I don't think it's until frankly, de Gaulle doesn't give the United States any choice. So as many of your viewers will know, that there was a plan on the table, the American government of the occupied territories, or AMGOT, for the United States to just outright occupy France, treat it as you were going to treat Italy or Germany, as an occupied country. Don't treat it like Norway or the Netherlands, a liberated country. And it's de Gaulle that makes that impossible to enforce. It's also pretty evident to American leaders by at least the end of 1944, early 45, that even if he hasn't been elected into the office yet, de Gaulle is clearly what the French people want. So that makes it very difficult for the United States to do anything different. But I would argue the Americans come to de Gaulle faute de mieux more than anything else. He's not what they want. And of course, he won't be what successive administrations will want for the foreseeable future. This is him after Eisenhower has left the White House at Eisenhower's estate near Gettysburg, and after de Gaulle, I believe, has left the French presidency, or at least at the very, very end of the French presidency. But de Gaulle remains a thorn in America and Britain's side for a long time to come.
And well, that talking about how they are still affecting things decades later is another reminder, because of just how many people who were in late power later on were involved in that 41, 42, 43 period. This photo here, which is a great one from 1960, de Gaulle, Macmillan, Eisenhower, there they all are. They're all involved in various levels in Operation Torch. Macmillan was there, and we could list others. The French presidents and prime ministers were involved there as well, ambassadors. That the number of people who, I hate the expression, but kind of cut their teeth on international relationships in this 42, 43 period is incredible, isn't it? So
it's incredible.
When we're looking at 2021 and the world has got all sorts of problems now, and there were problems in the 50s and 60s and the Suez crisis and this, that, how much of this all kind of connects back to these people brushing each other's past each other's shoulders in World War II, because it's extraordinary they were all in the place at the same time, isn't it?
It's amazing. And the relationships between them are multi-layered and very complicated. Just this morning, I ran by our archive and library to pick up a book, and there was a truckload of books that they were obviously getting ready to send back. And there was one that had a Free French logo on it. And I said, "What is that? I haven't seen that one before. Can I see that?" And I opened it up. It was a history of the French First Army in World War II. And inside, it is personally inscribed by Charles de Gaulle. It's personally a full-page inscription and a signature. And I asked the archivist, what is this? And he said, "Oh, yeah, we got a bunch of books back there that de Gaulle gave to the United States Army on the French resistance and on the liberation that were personal gifts from Charles de Gaulle to the U.S. Army." I had no idea. I've been here 10 years. I had no idea they were back there. So it is a very complicated relationship based, I think, as much on national interest as anything else, based on what these three men represent. I'm not, as an historian, very big on the kind of personal relationship thing. I think senior statesmen are able to get past people they don't like if there's a mutual interest they're both pursuing. So there are moments when interests diverge, as at Suez. There are moments when interests converge. And so, but it, I don't know. I haven't really looked into it that any of them ever actually refer back to North Africa. But as you said, when I started counting up the number of people, future heads of NATO armies and navies, and it's just astonishing how many of them are playing senior roles, important roles here in North Africa. It would be an interesting project to look at the relationship between these three men. I don't know if any scholar has looked at this conference in 1960. It might be fun to try to locate the records and see if you see how they are talking to one another.
Or go back in time and just be a fly on the wall at some of the brandy and cigar conversations late at night.
Wouldn't that be lovely? It's every historian's dream to be able to do that.
And talking about things at the War College, I mean, this is another part that you could conclude your book with this story of the flag there. So give a bit of insight into that, then I want to bring a couple of other subjects back up again. But just talk about the flag.
Yeah, so if you leave my office and go to the cafeteria to get an incredibly bad cup of coffee in our cafeteria, you will pass by this flag. My guess is most people barely look at it because an American flag in a military institution just isn't all that unusual a sight. The letter that you see there indicates that the flag flew over the grave of the Marquis de Lafayette in the Cimetière de Picpus near the Place de la Nation in Paris. Every year they replace the flag, or more maybe than every year. This one was handed from the French ami du Marquis de Lafayette to General Al Haig, who was then the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Haig then gave it to the United States Army War College, and it sits in this case here. The person who arranged all that was René de Chambrun, who, after the war, did everything that he could, both to get Pierre Laval exonerated or at least get his sentence reduced. That didn't work. Laval got executed, as in my view, he very well should have. And then Chambrun worked very hard to try to rebuild U.S.-French relationships. His personal papers are at Stanford University. They're not in France, which is an indication. And he worked very, very, very hard. We're about to get a brand new academic building. I've been in touch with the designers to see if this flag can be moved somewhere close to my office when the new building opens up. We'll see what they end up doing with it. I hope it's not a Raiders of the Lost Ark thing and it ends up in some giant warehouse being looked after by top men. But I'm going to continue to press for it to be put near my office. But I was just struck by it, that these relationships continued into the 1970s. I don't know if anybody that accepted this flag and this letter had any idea what René de Chambrun stood for, what he meant. He also, notably, was the lawyer who defended the collaborationist Coco Chanel at the end of the war. And one of my daughters did a History Day project on Coco Chanel. So it gave me a chance to, talk quite a bit about the collaborationist nature of many people in France and the way that they got away not only scot-free, several of them went on to become quite famous.
Well, you make the statement that effectively France is dealing with a civil war in World War II. I mean, we don't refer to it in those terms, but that to some extent is exactly what was going on at the time. And going back to your book there, when I received a copy of it, and I haven't put it on the shelf yet because I'm still reading it, but when I do, most books I get these days, there's an area where it'll go to where there's other books in that same theme. There's the generals' biographies, there's the D-Day books. I'm not really sure where I'm going to put your book yet. It made me realize how little we talk about that period of the war. There's a whole raft of books about why Britain got involved in the war and appeasement and Chamberlain. And there's a new film about Chamberlain coming out. He's out or coming out soon. And we talk about that a lot. And there's some great books on that. And we talk about the end of the war. We talk about 45. We talk about the dropping of the atomic bomb and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the beginning of the Cold War. But the middle part of it, because these events, Operation Torch is happening when there's a whole lot of stuff happening around the world, late 42, 43, Stalingrad, island hopping's going on. The Eastern Front is just one big, the Atlantic convoys are going on there. And I think with all that military stuff going on, I think some of the diplomatic, political decisions being made at the time just have kind of been lost in the gunfire. So I think that's why a book like yours is needed to kind of fill in that gap there, because although it's essentially about the fall of France, 1940, it takes us right up to the end of the war because of the fact these decisions had repercussions later on in the war. So I mean, that's why it's so important you did it. And I can't kind of believe someone hadn't done it before. That's because, as we said, it is just such a huge, complex onion with many layers to unwrap.
It is that, and the documents weren't easy to find. The French diplomatic archives at La Courneuve have what the Free French captured of the Vichy archives. Most of the Vichy stuff they obviously burned rather than let it fall into the hands of their opponents. The American stuff was kind of hard to find too. I got lucky because James Gavin, the American army commander, went to become President Kennedy's ambassador to France. So he asked for a copy of everything that had gone on, all the documentation with Vichy, because he wanted to know what had happened before he became an American ambassador to France. So I was lucky to have that here. And I was lucky to have Wild Bill Donovan's papers are here too. And he was deeply involved in Vichy stuff, at least early on.
I got to the point, I said I haven't finished it yet, where I was thinking, so who's the main figure that's going to appear on the next page? Because, there's another one. And I knew these names already, but I didn't know them in the context of what this discussion was about, which is ostensibly France's role in World War II. I couldn't believe the cast of characters. I mean, if you were making a movie about this story, the amount of cameos you could have would be insane, wouldn't it? Because everybody who was anybody kind of pops up in this story in some shape or form, it brings us back to the point I wanted to kind of towards the end of it. Why should Americans, why should the British and Canadian, Australian, American viewers watching this, why should we understand the role of Vichy France and how it affected the relationship between the USA and the UK? What, in our understanding of World War II, why is this story important to get to grips with?
Well, I think we talked about one already, which is to kind of round out some of the empty spaces in our understanding. I also tend to think it's an offhand line and it doesn't work terribly well all the time, but you can understand the First World War as a war between nation states and empires. The Second World War is in some ways a war of ideologies. It is a war that doesn't quite fit along national lines. The idea of a resistance movement in World War I doesn't make any sense until very late in the war. It does make sense in the World War II context because this is an ideological conflict. So there is a way in which you can use Vichy, A, to understand the war in a very different way than you thought about it before, and B, as you noted, and what kept coming back to me, and I'm grateful for that trip I took to Ethiopia because it helped me see this, the way in which Vichy is tying together Iraq, Syria, Ethiopia, Indochina, the way that Vichy is almost at the center of this kind of spoken hub that is going on, that's connecting these disparate global wars into one conflict. Later, of course, the United States too. It's really easy to see that through Vichy, the way in which these just as World War I, this is a global conflict that is can also be seen as a global conflict that has many conflicts underneath it. And again, if you want to look at French politics today, if you want to look at the nature of the French state today, I don't know how you do that without Vichy. And one of my French friends that I was talking about this project with in Paris before all travel shut down said you can really understand Vichy as the middle period between the French Revolution and where France is today. That the folks in Vichy are those folks who thought the revolution was just a bad idea, that it should never have happened, and we're going to roll some of that stuff back. So there's a way in which, I guess, when you were talking about your bookshelf, I was thinking if I weren't the author and I were to put it somewhere in my bookshelf, it might go in my French history from the revolution through the present day shelf. There's a way in which you can understand what France is going through, was going through, and continue to go through by looking at Vichy as the center of a triptych.
And I think that again, to summarize it, it's where we thought the Vichy as being peripheral to the outcome of World War II. It's actually central to it. And
Yeah,
Brad from On This Day in Canadian History said Vichy even plays a critical role indirectly in starting the war in the Pacific, which of course
yeah, I
it
agree.
does. And that's another whole
Agree.
subject we could go
Yep.
into there.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of books that take a subject that you think you understand, and then they just make you turn your perspective. They make you look at it a way that you hadn't thought about before. And I hope that that's what this book does, because if you put Vichy back into the center instead of on the periphery, the war looks at one moment very different, and on the other moment, like you said, you get these aha moments where, okay, that's how A connects to B connects to C, and that's why this individual was doing what this individual was doing.
So a couple of takeaways to end up. What I think we've covered this already, but for people who haven't bought the book yet, and not that we're doing just a sales pitch for the book, but we are doing a sales pitch for the book because I liked it and it's my show and we can. But the takeaways from this presentation, people are saying, where they could always watch World War II TV and be guaranteed to learn something about a subject they didn't know anything about before. And I'm very proud of that, because we don't do the endless, was it the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt that was the best fighter of World War II? Because that's been done 350,000 times on YouTube. We're trying to tackle new things. But, for those who are beginning their study of World War II, we've got some really loyal viewers who are really beginning their interest in World War II. Some takeaways about Vichy's importance. I mean, we know it influences the Anglo-US relationship. We know it influences the fears of the USA in terms of its own security. But anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention?
I think, one of my pet peeves when I talk to audiences in the United States, even well-educated audiences, is they tend to think that World War II is very neat, very black and white, very cut and dried. This puts a lot of shades of gray into that picture, and a lot of color into that picture. And more colorful pictures are not necessarily clearer pictures. So what I hope that this book does is get readers out of the mindset that everything in World War II was very easy. The decisions were easy to make. This was somehow simpler than either the First World War that came before it or the Korean and Vietnam Wars that come after it. And I think we've created World War II into something cleaner and neater than it was, to set it off in contradistinction to what came before it and what came after it. And what I want folks to see is that World War II resulted in the outcome that had to be the outcome. There's no question about it. That's the outcome that the free world was fighting towards. But that doesn't mean that there weren't difficult choices to be made and there weren't wrong choices to be made. And this picture is much more complicated than we often give it credit for. So I'm kind of famous here at the Army War College when folks ask me for an answer based on history, and my answer is, well, that's complicated, but there's no way around it. History is complicated and it's messy and it's unclear. It's all of those things, and I just get uncomfortable with Second World War histories that try to make something that complicated and reduce it to its simplicities.
Well,
And Vichy
I've been
shows you can't
threatening
do that.
to make a T-shirt with "Nuance is the new sexy" as a World War II TV kind of tagline for a lover. I haven't done it yet, but
I'll buy one. I'm in.
we're in a world where we want to tie everything up in neat packages and say this led to this, and this guy's a baddie and this guy's a goodie, and when you go scratch the surface, you realize it's not as simple as that. And a very good point that could lead us down a rabbit hole we will end with is Sheldrake is saying about how Vichy is reducing influence of far right in French politics for decades, and Vichy's leanings forcing the Gaullist camp. I'm going to turn that and talk about the fact that Vichy is now being used as a comparison in modern politics. France is getting close to the new election. I'm not going to explain French politics for people who don't live in France, but there are some candidates coming out who people are kind of making comparisons to Vichy. So to me, if something has a relevance today, whether that's an appropriate relevance or inappropriate, the fact it's being used by modern journalists to compare to today to Vichy means it's something worthy of our study, because we've had it in Britain for a long time with the Battle of Britain analogies that came out a lot in Brexit and Britain standing alone and all that bullshit. Don't get me started on that because I just get angry. But Vichy is becoming relevant again. What Vichy represented, how Vichy was used by or seen by other nations, is becoming relevant again, and it's both exciting that the period of history is being studied again, but it's worrying that we're making these comparisons to something that, as you said at the beginning, we're not defending what Vichy stood for. We're not in any way giving these people a free ride that were involved in it. What we're saying is it's worth studying this period at a greater level. I think that's the takeaway there. So your book is not quite, it's in November. It's next month it's out, isn't it, for sale?
It's out in the United States officially today, though the major booksellers have been distributing it. So I'm not really sure what's going on, but the official pub date in the USA is today. I don't know what's going on in Europe.
Okay, well, I think when I looked on Amazon in France, I think it said it was still November. It still said pre-order, but that may have been 2 or 3 days ago. But anyway, folks, the link to buying the book via bookshop is in the description below. But of course, you can buy it at your local bookshop, wherever you want there. But I will just remind people what we've got coming up tomorrow, Michael, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So tomorrow, folks, one more show in France at War Week. We have a show about the Royal Scots Fusiliers in the Battle of the Ypres Commune Canal in 1940 with Ian Miskimmins. So that's going back to a nice kind of explanation of a battle in 1940, one of those ones that happened. We all know about the Dunkirk evacuations, but we forget about the fact there are these hard-fought actions occurring elsewhere, so near the coast, but in this case, inland away. So that Ian will be joining us to talk about that tomorrow. And then next week, we have a few shows, Mediterranean, in World War II. James Holland is on. Onur Izzy, the Turkish historian, is coming on to talk about Turkey's very complicated role as a neutral nation in World War II. That'll be a fascinating show. So all those I listed on YouTube today. So check us out what's coming on there. As usual, consider becoming a Patreon to help us support these financially. Tweet what we're doing, share what we're doing on social media. Michael Neiberg's Twitter account, worth following as well. Interesting stuff coming up there. And thank you very much for watching us. But right now, it remains for me to say thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. And I'm hoping you'll come back probably next August and talk about the liberation of Paris, perhaps in conjunction with the anniversary there, because your book on Paris is... when I reread it last week, I kept having to put it down and tell Mag, you should read this, because it just one of the books, I call it a game changer, the understanding of that. Fantastic. So if you'd like to book it, I'll put you on the spot and make you say yes now, so you can't back down. So that would be brilliant if you could do that next August.
Yeah, I would be delighted to. I'd be absolutely delighted to.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. So I hope you had as much fun as I did hosting this show, folks, because it was a fantastic subject, and I urge you to go out there and buy the book. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy your weekend, although we have got one more show tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge saying enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for your attention. It would be pointless if it was just me here talking to myself. Thank you very much, everybody. See you again.